More than 2,000 years ago, at a time when the people in the British Isles and in most parts of Western Europe were living the lives of savages, occupied in fighting, hunting, and fishing, dwelling in rude huts clad in skins, ignorant of everything that we call civilization. Rome was the center of a world in many ways as civilized as ours is now, over which the Roman people ruled the men who dwelt in this one city. Built on 7 hills on the banks of the river Tiber, gradually conquered all Italy. Then they became masters of the lands round the Mediterranean Sea, of northern Africa and of Spain, of Greece, Egypt, Asia Minor and the Near East. And of Western Europe, the greatness of Rome and of the Roman people does not lie, however, in their conquest. In the end, their conquest ruined them. It lies in the character, mind, and will of the Romans themselves. In the history of the ancient world, the Romans played the part that men of our race have played in the history of the modern world. They knew, as we claim to know, how to govern themselves and how to govern other people. To this day, much in our laws and in our system of government bears a Roman stamp. They were great soldiers and could conquer. They could also hold and keep their conquests and impress the Roman stamp on all the peoples over. When they ruled, their stamp is still upon us. Much that belongs to our common life today comes to us from them. In their day, they lived a life not much unlike ours now. And in many respects, the Roman character was like the British. We can see the faults of the Romans. If we cannot see our own, we can also see the virtues. We can say it too. Looking back at them over the distance of time, judging them by their work and by what is left to us of their writings. How the mixture of faults and their virtues explains the fall as well as the rise of the great power of Rome. You Romans were men of action, not dreamers. They were more interested in doing things than in understanding them. They were men of strong will and cool mind who looked out upon the world as they saw it, and, for the most part, did not wonder much about how and why it came to be there. It was there for them to rule. That was what interested them. Ideas they mostly got from other people, especially from the Greeks. When they had got them, they could use them and turn them to something of their own. But they were not distracted by puzzling over ideas. Their religion was that of a practical people in the later days of Rome. A few educated men believed in the gods, but all the ceremonies and festivals were dedicated to them. And magnificent temples in their honor were erected in which their spirits were supposed to dwell. In the old days, every Roman household had its particular images. The laws and tenets which the head of the family tended and guarded connected with this office was the sacred authority of the head of the family. The paterfamilias, his word was law for the members of the household, and the city of Rome stood to its citizens in the place of the paterfamilias. The first laws of a Roman's life were his duty to his father and to the state. They had an absolute claim on him for all that he could give a Roman's code of honor. Like the Englishman's, rested on this sense of duty. A man must be worthy of his ancestors, and of Rome his own life was short, and without honor nothing. The life of Rome went on courage, devotion to duty, strength of will, a great power of silence, a sense of justice rather than any sympathy in his dealings with other men. These were the characteristic Roman virtues. The Roman was proud. He had a high idea of what was due from himself. This was the groundwork out of which his other qualities grew, good and bad. Proud men are not apt to understand the weakness of other people or to appreciate virtues different from their own. The defects of the Romans were therefore hardness, sometimes amounting to cruelty both in action and in judgment, lack of imagination, a blindness to the things in life that cannot be seen or measured. They were just rather ungenerous. They trampled on the defeated and scorned what they could not understand. They worshipped success and cared little for human suffering. About this, however, they were honest. Sentimentalism was not a Roman vice. No hypocrisy.
When great wealth
poured into the city after the eastern conquests of Lucullus and Pompeius. The simplicity of the old Roman life was destroyed, and men began to care for nothing but luxury, show, and all the visible signs of power. They were quite open about it. They did not pretend that they really cared for other things or talk about the burden of empires. The heroes of Roman history are men of action as they pass before us, so far as we can see their faces, hear their voices, know their natures from the stories. Recorded by those who wrote them down at the time or later, these men stand out in many respects, astonishingly like the men of our own day, good and bad. Centuries of dust lie over them, their bones are crumbled to the dust. Yet in a sense they live still and move among us. Between them and us there lie not only centuries, but the great tide of ruin that swept the ancient world away, destroyed it so that the men who came after had to build the house of civilization, stone by stone anew from the foundation. The Roman world was blotted out by the barbarians for hundreds of years. The kind of life men had lived in Rome disappeared altogether, and the very records of it seemed to be lost gradually, bit by bit. The story has been pieced together, and the men of 2,000 years ago stand before us. We see them across the gulf. The faces of those belonging to the earliest story of Rome are rather dim, but they too help us to understand what the Romans were like. We learn to know a people from the men it chooses as its heroes. About when fathers tell stories to their children, they show what are the deeds and qualities they admire, what kind of men they're trying to be.
The oldest Roman stories give a description of the coming of the people who afterwards inhabited the city from across the seas. They tell of the founding of the first township around the 7 hills and of the kings, especially of the last 7, who ruled over the people until, for their misdeeds, they were driven out. And the very name of king became hateful in Roman ears. Then there are many tales of the wars between the people of Rome and the neighbors dwelling round them on the plains of Latium and among the hills of Etruria and Samnium. And the fierce battles fought against the Gauls who, from time to time, swept down on Italy from the mountains of the north. These stories do not tell us much that can be considered as actual history, but they do help us to understand what the Romans wished to be like by showing us the sort of pictures they held up before themselves. In later times, the Romans learned to admire intensely all that came from Greece. The Greeks had been a great ruling people when the Roman state hardly existed, and from them much in Roman life and thought was borrowed. They liked to think that the first settlers on the Tiber bank came from an older, finer world than that of the other tribes dwelling in Italy. So that he told how, after the great siege of Troy by the Greek heroes Aeneas, one of the Trojan leaders fled from his ruined city across the seas, bearing his father and his household gods upon his shoulders. And after many adventures, and some time passed in a great city of Carthage on the African coast, came with a few trusty companions to the shores of Latium, and they founded a new home. The descendants of Aeneas ruled over their people as kings in later days. However, the Romans, who held that all citizens were free and equal, hated the name of King. Rome was a republic. Its government was carried on by men elected by the citizens from among themselves, and by assemblies in which all citizens could take part. The first duty of every citizen was to the republic. Its claim on him stood before all other claims, the story of the fall of the last king and of Lucius Jurius Brutus, one of the first consuls, as the chief magistrates of the new republic were called, shows clearly how far the idea of duty to the republic could go in the minds of Romans. The last king of Rome was Tarquin the proud, his misrule, and the insolent. heartlessness of his family, especially of his son, Sextus, brought about their expulsion from Rome and the end of the kingship. Sextus, hired by guile, got into the town of Galbi, but was at a loss how to make himself master there. He managed to send out a messenger to his father. It was summer in the garden, where the king was walking. Poppies, white and purple, were grown in long rings. Tarquin said nothing to the messenger. Only as he walked, he struck off with his staff the heads of the tallest poppies, one after another, without saying a word. Sextus, when the messenger came back and described to him his father's action, understood pitilessly. He put the leading men of Gabi to the sword. It was the misdeeds of this Sextus that brought the proud house of Tarquin to the ground. He tried to force his brutal love on the fair Lucretia, the wife of his cousin Calatinus, and so shamed her that, after telling her husband how she had been wronged, Lucretia killed herself before his eyes and those of his friend. Brutus stirred to deepest wrath Calatinus and Brutus, then swore a great oath to drive the house of Tarquin from Rome and henceforth allow no king to rule over the free people of the city. When they had told their fellow citizens how Sextus had wronged Lucretia, the daughter of one of the proudest families in the city, and reminded them of the oppression and injustice they had all suffered at the hands of his family, the leading men of Rome rose up and drove the Tarquins out the city. It was proclaimed forever a republic to be ruled not by any one man, but by the will, and for the good of all free men who dwelt in it. Some there were, however, who took the side of Tarquin and tried to bring him back among them. With the two sons of Brutus, they were captured and brought up for judgment. And like the others condemned to death, Brutus was the judge, though they were his sons and he loved them. He condemned them unflinchingly without any sign of feeling. He saw them go to their death. An action for which he would have sentenced another man seemed to him no less wrong when committed by his own children. The death of Lucretia. They tried to soothe her grief, laying the blame not on the unwilling victim, but on the perpetrator. Of the offense it is the mind, they said, not the body that sins. Where there is no intention, there is no fault. It is for you, she replied, to consider the punishment that is his due. I acquit myself of guilt, but I do not free myself from the penalty. No woman who lives after her honor is lost shall appeal to the example of Lucretia. Then she took a knife which she had hidden under her dress, plunged it into her heart, and dropping down soon expired. Her husband and father made the solemn invocation of the dead. While the others were occupied in mourning, Brutus drew the knife from the wound, held it still, reeking before him, and exclaimed, I swear by this blood pure and undefiled before the prince's outrage, and I call you gods to witness that I will punish Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, his impious wife, and all his children with fire and sword to the utmost of my power, and that I will not allow them or any other to rule in Rome. After this, he handed the knife to Calatinus, next to Lucretius and Valerius, all amazed at Brutus and perplexed to account for his new spirit of authority. They took the oath as he directed, and changing wholly from grief to anger, they obeyed his summons to follow him and make an immediate end of the royal power. The body of Lucretia was brought from her house and carried to the forum, the people thronging round as was natural, in wonder at the strange and cruel sight, and loud in condemning the crime of Tarquinius. They were deeply moved by the father's sorrow, and still more by the words of Brutus, who rebuked their tears and idle laments, urging them to act like men and Romans by taking up arms against the common enemy.
Others in the long and bitter wars that followed Tarquin found refuge with Lars, Porsenna, king of the Etruscans, who pretended to be eager to restore him while he really wanted to submit the Roman people to his own rule. Porsenna laid siege to the city, and the people were reduced to the hardest straits. A young man named Caius Mucius determined to kill Lars Porsenna. He succeeded in passing through the enemy's lines and made his way into their camp. There he saw a man clad in purple whom he took to be Lars Porsenna in his heart. He plunged the dagger he had hidden under the folds of his toga. The man fell dead.
But he was not, but Mucius was carried before Lars, and to him he said, I am a Roman. My name Caius Mucius. There in Rome hundreds of young men resolved as I was to take your life or perish in the attempt. You may slay me, but you cannot escape them all. Porcina demanded the names of the others. Mucius refused to speak. When Porcina said he would compel him to speak by torture, Mucius merely smiled on the altar. A flame was burning to prove to the ally of Tarquin of what stuff the young men of Rome were made. He thrust his right arm into the flame and held it so without flinching until the flesh was charred away. Such, his action showed the king, was the spirit of Rome. Mucius. The spirit of Rome, see caption. Roman legendary from a Britmas bronze. Mucius was escaping through the scared throng that fell away before his bloody dagger when, summoned by the shouts, the king's guards seized him and dragged him back, standing helpless before the throne. But even in such desperate position, more formidable than afraid, yet he cried out, I am a Roman citizen. My name is Caius Mucius. My purpose was to kill an enemy of my country. I have as much courage to die as I had to slay. A Roman should be ready for great deeds and great suffering, nor have I alone been emboldened to strike this blow. Behind me is a long line of comrades who seek the same honor. Therefore, if you choose, prepare for a struggle in which you will fight for your life every hour of the day and have the sword of an enemy at your palace door, such as the war that we, the youth of Rome, proclaim against you. You need not fear armies and battles by yourself. You will meet us one by one. When the king, enraged and terrified, was threatening to have him thrown into flames unless he explained the hints of assassination thus vaguely uttered, he replied, see how worthless the body is to those whose gaze is fixed on glory. But these words he laid his right hand on a brazier already lighted for the sacrifice and let it burn, too resolute, as it seemed, to feel pain. Then Porcina, astounded at the sight, ordered Mucius to be removed from the altar and exclaimed, begone, your own desperate enemy more than mine. I would wish well to your valor, if that valor was on the side of my country. As it is, I send you hence unharmed and free from the penalties of war. Livy, I-12A-14. Later in the same war, the Romans were compelled to give hostages. 24 men and maidens Clolia, a highborn maiden sent to Munda, escaped at night, and on horseback swam across the foaming Tiber to Rome. But since she had been given as a hostage and faith for its given was sacred, the Roman leaders sent her back Clolia's heroism. This reward granted to the heroism of Mucius inspired women also with ambition to win honor from the people. The maiden Clolia, one of the hostages, escaped the sentries of the Etruscan camp which had been pitched near the Tiber, and amid a shower of missiles swam across the river, leading a band of means whom she brought back safe to their families in Rome. When Porcina heard of it, he was at first enraged and sent envoys to the city with the demand for the return of his hostage Clolia. He made no great account of the others afterwards, his anger being changed to admiration. He said that her exploits surpassed anything done by Horatius or Mucius, and declared that he would consider the treaty broken if the hostage was not surrendered, but that if she was, he would send her back unharmed to her people. Faith was kept on both sides. The Romans returned the guarantee of peace in accordance with the terms of the treaty, and the king not only protected but honored the heroine, making her a present of half the hostages and bidding her choose as she pleased. The story is that when they were brought before her, she picked out the youngest, a choice at once creditable to her modesty and approved by the unanimous wish of the rest that those whose age made them most helpless should be liberated first after the restoration of peace. The Romans recognized this unexampled heroism in a woman with the honor, also unexampled, of an equestrian statue. It was placed at the top of the sacred way, a maiden sitting on a horse.
Regulus. In the first war against Carthage, Regulus, A Roman general was heavily defeated and taken prisoner with a large part of his army shortly. Afterwards, the Roman fleet was destroyed by a terrible storm. Nevertheless, the events of the next year's campaign went against the Carthaginians. They determined to offer peace, and for this purpose sent an embassy to Rome. With this embassy, Regulus was sent, on the understanding that if he failed to induce his countrymen to make peace and to agree to an exchange of prisoners, he would return to Carthage, where, as he well knew, a terrible fate certainly awaited. Nevertheless, despite the appeals of his wife and children, Regulus urged his countrymen not to make peace. His body might belong to the Carthaginians who had captured it, but his spirit was Roman, and no Roman could urge his countrymen to accept defeat and give up fighting until they had won true to his vow. He went back to Carthage, and there he was put to dreadful tortures. His eyelids were cut off, and he was then exposed to the full glare of the sun. But the story of his devotion remained strong in the minds of his countrymen, and Horace, one of their great poets, later put it into lines of imperishable verse: the honor of Regulus. Such a downfall had the prescient soul of Regulus feared, when he refused assent to dishonorable terms and maintained that the precedent would be fatal in time to come if the prisoners did not die. "Antetate I have seen," he said, "our eagles hanging on Carthaginian shrines, and weapons of our soldiers surrendered without bloodshed. I have seen arms bound behind the back of the free, and gates thrown open in security, and lands tilled that our armies had wasted. Think you that the soldier, ransomed with gold, will return the braver? You do, but add loss to disgrace. Wool, tinctured by dye, never regains its old purity, nor does true courage. If once it is lost, deign to be restored to the degraded. If the stag fights after being frayed from the meshes of the net, he will be brave who has surrendered to a treacherous foe. And he will crush the Carthaginians in a second fight, who without resentment has felt the thongs binding his arms and has feared death. Such a man, all ignorant of the way to win a soldier's life, has confused peace and war. O lost honor, O mighty Carthage, exalted by the shameful downfall of Italy. It is said that he put from him the lips of his virtuous wife and his little children, a free citizen no longer, and with grim resolution turned his eyes to the ground, till with the weight of advice never given by any before him, he strengthened the wavering purpose of the fathers. And amid the mourning of his friends hurried into a noble exile. Yet, though he knew what the barbarian tormentor had in store for him, he set aside opposing kinsmen and people that would delay his return as quietly as if you were leaving the business of some client's suit. At last decided, and were journeying to his estate in Vena from Rhoda Tarentum, that the Spartan-built Horace, OD 51356 Marcus Curtius, where Rome's most precious possessions to this Christian is splendid, answer was given by Marcus Curtius in the midst of the forum, the marketplace, in the heart of the city where public business was transacted and men met daily to discuss politics and listen to speeches. The citizens found one morning that a yawning gulf had opened this, so the priests declared would not close until the most precious thing that Rome possessed had been thrown into it, and the Republic would be safe and everlasting. For a time men puzzled and pondered over the meaning of this dark saying. Marcus Curtius, a youth who had covered himself with honor in many battles, saw if the riddle brave men, he said, had made Rome great. The city had nothing so precious, clad in full armor, and mounted on his war horse he leaped into the gulf. It closed over him at once, nor ever opened again. The devotion of Marcus Curtius. During the same year, as the story goes, a cavern of measureless depth was opened in the middle of the forum, either from the shock of an earthquake or from some other hidden force. And though all did their best by throwing soil into it, the gulf could not be filled up till, warned by the gods, the people began to inquire what was Rome's greatest treasure, for that treasure, so the prophets declared, must be offered in it, if the Roman commonwealth was to be safe and lasting. Whereupon Marcus Curtius, a warrior renowned in war,
rebuked them for doubting whether the Romans had any greater blessing than arms and valor. Amid a general silence, he devoted himself, looking to the capital and the temples of the immortal gods that overhang the forum, and stretching out his hands, at one time to the sky, at another to the yawning chasm that reached to the world below. Then, fully armed and seated on a horse splendidly caparisoned, he plunged into its depths, while a crowd of men and women showered corn and other offerings after him. Thus we may suppose that the Curtain Lake got its name from him, and not from courteous metas. In old time, the famous soldier of Titus, Tatius, Livy Vi6, seat caption, Elacus Curtius, restored, in Mucius Scaevola and Regulus, in Marcus Curtius, and many others, the fine qualities of the old Roman temper: pride, courage, will, devotion, a love of their country that went beyond all other feelings, even unto death, stand out. One can see the main lines of the character that made the Romans what they afterwards became, the conquerors and lawgivers, first of the single city of Rome, then of the whole plain of Latium in which that city stood. Then, after driving back barbarian invaders from the north and Greek invaders from the south of all Italy, later of the known world, Coriolanus. To understand this character better, one may look at it from another angle, studying a man in whom these qualities were spoiled by the faults that belong to them. Courage may become cruelty, pride fall into arrogance, high contempt for others will grow to selfishness and hardness. Even a high devotion to one's country may be spoiled if it comes to mean a devotion to one's own idea of what that country should be like and how it should treat oneself. It may then be mere selfishness. Many men love their country not as it is, but as they think it ought to be. This may be a good and helpful feeling if what they think it ought to be depends not on their own private wishes and welfare only, but on that of the people as a whole. A love of country of this kind makes men strive incessantly to make it better. That some Romans forgot the welfare of the people as a whole, the men belonging to the old families, men who claimed to be descended from the early settlers, who called themselves patricians, that is, the fathers of the state, were apt to consider that what they thought must be so, that they alone knew what was right and good. The welfare of the state depended on them. They were the leaders in the army and in the government. They had no patience with those who said that they should not settle everything in Rome, that their idea of what was right, patriotic, was not the end of the matter. Men who said that Rome was not this class or that, but the whole people, the city was growing fast. New settlers had come in, men not counted as citizens, but men whose happiness and comfort depended on the way the state treated them. These people, the plebs as they were called, were despised by many patricians. They looked upon them not as Romans, but as creatures who could be made into soldiers when the city needed soldiers, but at other times should keep quiet. The faults and virtues of the patricians, and nearly all the heroes of Roman story, belonged to patrician families, are well shown in the life of Caius Morcius, called Coriolanus in honor of his victory outside the town of Corioli.
The capture of Corioli. One of the leading men in the camp was C. Marcius, who afterwards received the name of Coriolanus, a youth of equal vigor in counsel and in action. The Roman army was besieging Corioli, and, occupied with its people shut up behind their walls, had no fear of attack from without. When the Volscian troops from Antium swept down upon it, at the same time the enemy sallied. Out of the town Marcius happened to be on duty, and with some picked troops not only repelled the sally, but fearlessly rushed in through the open gate, and, after slaughtering the enemy in the neighborhood, chanced to come across some lighted brands and flung them onto the buildings that had joined the wall. Then the cries of the townsmen, mingled with the shrieks of women and children that quickly arose as usual when the alarm was given, encouraged the Romans and dismayed the Volscians, inasmuch as they found that the city which they had come to help was in the hands of the enemy. Thus the Volscians from Antium were routed and Corioli was taken, Livy, I-33-59.
Caius Marcius belonged to one of the oldest and proudest families in the Republic. A member of this family had been one of the 7 kings. His father died when Caius was but a boy, and he was left in the charge of his mother. Volumnia was a woman of noble character and fine mind. Her house was admirably ordered. Everything in it was beautiful and yet simple. She brought up her son well. He excelled in all manly exercises, was of a courage that nothing could shake, scorned idleness, luxury, and wealth. Believed that the one life for a Roman was a life of service to the death, but Volumnia did not succeed as a father might have done in curbing the faults of the lad's character. Caius grew up headstrong, obstinate, and excessively proud, personally highly gifted in mind and body. He was disposed to look down upon others less firm and resolute, he set for himself a high standard of uprightness and courage, and cared nothing for what other people thought of him. Among the youths with whom he grew up, he was the natural leader. His will brooked no contradiction. Few dared to criticize or oppose him. Those less firm in mind, less brave in action, less indifferent to the opinion of others. He despised anyone who failed in courage, endurance, or devotion. He condemned without sympathy. One but a lad he won for bravery in battle. The crown of oak leaves given to soldiers who saved the life of a comrade in action. In all the fighting of the hard years in which Rome was defending itself against the other Italian peoples, Marcius was ever to the fore. He shrank from no fatigue, no danger. He was always in the hottest of the fight. First as a simple soldier, then as a general in the field, his soldiers adored him because he shared all their hardships and always led them to victory, always too. He refused to take any reward in money or riches. But when these same soldiers got back to Rome, Coriolanus had no sympathy with them. Fighting was life to him. He did not see why it should not satisfy everyone or understand the hardships of the common man, whose wife and children were left behind in wretched poverty. There were indeed many things Coriolanus did not see his harsh mind condemn without understanding the complaints of the poor to him. It seemed that they thought of themselves instead of thinking about Rome. He did not realize that their hard lot compelled them to do so. His wealth from birth made them free. But they were not free. All the land belonged to the patricians. Wars made them richer because the things their land produced fetched high prices. But the poor family starved while the father was away at the wars, unable to earn. And they had no money with which to purchase things. They had to pay taxes. And wars always mean heavy taxes. They fell into debt, and under the harsh Roman law, a debtor could be first imprisoned and then, unless someone helped him by paying off what he owed, sold as a slave. Even a man serving in the army might have his house and all the poor household goods he had left at home seized because he or his wife had got into debt. This harsh law finally produced a mutiny. The whole army marched out of Rome and, taking up a position on a sacred mount outside, stayed there until the Senate, this was the ruling body of the state, agreed first to change the harsh laws about debt, and second to give to the poor people a body of men to look after their interest. These were the tribunes. The appointment of these tribunes angered many patricians, and especially Coriolanus, not understanding the sufferings of the people. He had always been far removed himself from any such difficulties, belonging as he did to a family of wealth and dignity. He thought that their discontents were created by talk and idleness.
And since there were men in Rome who got it cheap, popularity by perpetually reminding the people of their wrongs, he sometimes seemed to be right. The tribunes he regarded as noxious busybodies whose loose talk was dividing Rome into 2 parties. In fact, there were 2 parties. Coriolanus could not see that the real cause of the division was not what the tribunes said, but what the people suffered. He could see no right but his own.
and all his powerful will was set to driving that right throw to yield seemed to him pusillanimous. There was bound to be a fierce struggle, and it soon came. Coriolanus made bitter, scornful speeches, which enraged the people. They smarted under his biting words and forgot all his great deeds. He became more and more unpopular. This unpopularity only made him despise the people, who judged men by words and not by deeds at last. The tribunes accused him of trying to prevent their receiving the corn that had been sent to them by the city of Syracuse, and of aiming at making himself ruler in the city. Finally, they demanded that he should be banished. Coriolanus scorned to defend himself. Instead of that, he attacked the tribunes and abused the people in terms of cruel scorn and contempt. When the vote banishing him was carried, he turned on them, declaring that they made him despise not only them but Rome. He banished them. There was a world elsewhere. But though Coriolanus had always declared that he cared more for Rome than for anything and desired not his own greatness, but that of the city, and now pretended to scorn the people and the sentence they had passed upon him. His actions showed how far his bitterness had eaten into his own soul. He turned his back on Rome and betook himself to the camp of Tullus Aufidius, the leader of the people of Antium, then engaged in war against the Republic and prepared to assist him in order to punish the ungrateful Romans from this dreadful action. He was saved by his mother Valonia. Her patriotism was truer and more unselfish than is with his wife and his young children. She came to the camp, clad in the garb of deepest mourning. Dust scattered upon her gray hairs, and went on her knees to her son to implore him not to dishonor himself by fighting against his country. At last, the true nobleness in the soul of Coriolanus made its way through the anger and bitterness that had darkened him. He acceded to Valonia's prayers, though he well knew what the price for himself would be. Rome was saved from a great danger. Since the city had no general to equal Coriolanus, he himself, however, was assassinated by the orders of Aufidius, who soon afterwards was badly defeated in the field. Coriolanus said to his mother, when she at last persuaded him to yield, that she had won a noble victory for Rome, but one that was fatal to her son. He was right. His very words showed that in some part of his mind, he realized how wrong and really unpatriotic his action had been. In joining with the enemies of Rome, he had shown clearly that what he loved was not his country, but his own pride in the end. Thanks to Valonia, he bent his head. The lesson to the Romans was a clear one, and in the years that followed, it was not forgotten. Coriolanus was remembered as a hero, but also as a warning. When real danger threatened Rome, the people stood unshaken from without and from within. In the Roman camp, there were never any traitors. Chapter 3. The great enemies of Rome. The early history of Rome is a history of war. Its heroes are soldiers. When the city was founded, and throughout its early life, Italy was divided among different peoples, ruling over different parts of the country. With these peoples, the Latins, the Etruscans, the Volscians, the Samnites, the Romans fought a war. With one or other of them was always going on its fortune third. But in the end, the Roman spirit and the Roman organization toward one by one the other Italian tribes submitted and accepted Roman overlordship. This was a long and slow business, extending over hundreds of years. One that was still going on. The Romans had the meeting of a danger. The danger of invasion from without again and again. The Gauls swept down upon Italy from the north. They actually occupied parts of the city of Rome itself. After that, they were finally driven out and defeated by Camillus later. Though they came again across the northern hills, they were always beaten and driven back when on the march their armies were dangerous. But the Gauls had no plan of permanent conquest. After a defeat, they retired to their northern plains and hills within the space of 100 years in the 3rd century before the birth of Christ. The Romans had to meet 2 invaders of a very different and far more dangerous kind, invaders with a settled plan of conquest, who came against them in order to subdue and rule Rome and Italy. These were Pyrrhus and Hannibal. Had either of them succeeded, the whole history of Rome and of the world might have been different. In a very real sense, Pyrrhus and Hannibal are heroes in the story of Rome. They were the greatest enemies the Roman people ever had to meet. They were defeated because of qualities in the Roman people as a whole, rather than by the genius of any single general. No single Roman leader at the time was a first-rate commander like Pyrrhus, still less a genius like Hannibal. The much greater man than he it is during their struggle with Pyrrhus, in the war with Carthage that followed Pyrrhus's defeat, and in the long war with Hannibal that ended in his defeat, and the destruction of Carthage as a great power that we can see the Roman character at its best. We can appreciate it and understand it only by understanding the enemies whom it met and broke Pyrrhus. At the time of his attack upon Italy, Pyrrhus, king of Epirus, was the most brilliant soldier of his day, and his ambition was to rule, like Alexander, over a world greater than that of his own Greek kingdom from babyhood. He breathed and grew up amid storm and adventure. All his life he was most at home in camps and on the battlefield. His father was killed in battle and Pyrrhus was but 5 years old. He himself was only saved from death by a faithful slave, who carried him to the house of the king of the Illyrians and laid him at his feet. The baby Pyrrhus clasped the knees of the monarch who, looking into his face, could not resist the appeal of the child's eyes, that kept him safe till he was 12 years old, and then helped to put him on his father's throne, though only a boy. Pyrrhus held it for 5 years. He was driven out, but later he recovered his kingdom again. As he grew up, he studied the art of war constantly and wrote a handbook on tactics as Plutarch, who wrote his life, puts it. He was persuaded that neither to annoy others nor be annoyed by them was a life insufferably languishing and tedious as Pyrrhus. Pyrrhus expressed the strong, generous simplicity and directness of his character and singleness of aim. The most remarkable feature in his face was his mouth, for his front teeth were formed of a continuous piece of bone, marked only with small lines resembling the divisions of a row of teeth. Fear was absolutely unknown to him. His weakness was that he did not understand men. Though a brilliant soldier, he knew nothing about government. He was a soldier. Only he could win battles, but not rule men.
Pyrrhus came to Italy on the invitation of the people of Tarentum. Tarentum was a wealthy and flourishing city in the south, originally a Greek settlement. Its people were famous for the luxury and elegance of their houses and lives, and scorned the rude, hardy, and simple Romans as untutored barbarians. When some Roman ships appeared in their harbor, they were sunk by the Tarentines, who thought that as the Romans were at that time busy, the Gauls had swept down from the north and they were engaged with a war against the Samnites. Tarentum was safe from them, but the Romans at once declared war.
Twin Tarentines took fright.
They had no mind for fighting themselves and looked about for someone who would do it for them. Thus they called to Pyrrhus to save the Greeks in Italy. Pyrrhus saw in their appeal his chance of realizing what for the great Alexander had remained a dream, an empire in the west. He took sail at once.
He was indeed so eager that he started in midwinter despite the storms and lost part of his fleet on the way. Nevertheless, he brought a great army with him. Macedonian foot soldiers, then considered the best in the world, horsemen, archers, and slingers and elephants, never before seen in Italy. In Tarentum he found nothing ready. His first task was to make the idle, luxurious city into a camp. The inhabitants, who cared for nothing but feasting, drinking, and games, did not like this. But it was too late to be sorry.
Pyrrhus had come.
And since no other towns in Italy gave any sign of joining him, he had to make the most of Tarentum.
Tarentines.
Who had been used to having all their fighting done for them by slaves, now had to go into training themselves. In the spring, the Roman army took the field and marched south against the invader. When Pyrrhus surveyed from a hill the Roman camp and line of battle, he exclaimed in surprise.
These are no barbarians.
In the end, he won a victory at Heraclea, partly by reason of a panic caused among the Roman soldiers by the elephants. They had never seen such beasts before, but the victory was a very expensive one. Pyrrhus' own losses were so heavy that he said, "One more victory like this, and I shall be ruined." As he walked over the field at night and saw the Roman dead, all their wounds in front, lying where they had fallen in their own lives, he cried, "Had I been king of these people, I should have conquered the world." The deep impression was made on him by the envoy Fabricius. Plutarch tells the story.
Pyrrhus and Fabricius.
Presently, envoys came to negotiate about the fate of the prisoners, and among them Gaius Fabricius, that was famed among the Romans. Decius told the king for uprightness and military talent, and for extreme poverty as well. Therefore Pyrrhus received him kindly, apart from the rest, and urged him to accept the present, of course not corruptly, but as a so-called token of friendship and intimacy. When Fabricius refused, the king did no more for the moment. But next day, wishing to try his nerves as he had never seen an elephant, he had the largest of these beasts, but behind a curtain close to them as they conversed. This was done, and at a signal the curtain was drawn aside, and a beast suddenly raised its trunk and held it over the head of Fabricius. Uttered a harsh and terrifying cry. Undisturbed, he turned round and smiling said to Pyrrhus, "Yesterday your gold did not move me, nor does your elephant today." At dinner all sorts of subjects were discussed, and as a great deal was said about Greece and its philosophers, Decius happened to mention Epicurus, and explained the doctrines of his disciples about the gods and service to the state and the chief end of life. This last, as he said, they identified his pleasure while they avoided service to the state, as interrupting and marring their happiness, and banished the gods far away from love and anger and care from mankind to an untroubled life of ceaseless enjoyment. Before he had finished, Fabricius interrupted him and said, "By Hercules,
I hope that Pyrrhus and the Samnites will hold these doctrines as long as they are at war with us."
This filled Pyrrhus with such admiration of his high spirit and character that he was more anxious than before to be on terms of friendship instead of hostility with the Romans. And he privately urged Fabricius to arrange a peace and to take service with him, and live as the first of all his comrades and generals. It is said that he quietly replied, "O king, you would gain nothing, for these very men who now honor and admire you would prefer my rule to yours, if they once get to know me."
And Pyrrhus did not receive them with anger, or in a spirit of offended majesty, but he actually told his friends of the nobility of Fabricius and gave him sole charge of the prisoners on the understanding that if the Senate refused the peace, they should be sent back after greeting their friends and keeping the festival of Saturn. As it happened, they were sent back after the festival, the Senate ordaining the penalty of death for anyone who stayed behind. Plutarch XX20.
He was yet more deeply impressed by the strength of the Roman character a little later, when he found that none of the Latins were going to join him. Pyrrhus sent an ambassador to the Senate, offering terms of peace. This ambassador was loaded with costly presents for the leading Romans and their wives. All these gifts were refused. Then Pyrrhus's envoy came before the Senate to see whether eloquence could not do what bribes had failed to effect. He had been a pupil of the great Demosthenes, the most wonderful orator of Greece, and his golden words moved many of the senators. They thought it would be wise to make terms. But old Appius Claudius, one of the most distinguished men in Rome, the builder of the great military road known as the Appian Way, had been carried into the Senate house by his sons and servants. For he was very old and nearly blind. He now rose to his feet, and his speech made these senators ashamed of themselves. Hitherto, he cried, I have regarded my blindness as a misfortune. But now, Romans, I wish I had been deaf as well as blind, for then I should not have heard these shameful counsels. Who is there who will not despise you and think you an easy conquest? If Pyrrhus not only escapes unconquered, but gains Tarentum as a reward for insulting the Romans. His words stirred the senators deeply. They voted as one man to continue the war. Pyrrhus's ambassador was told to tell his master that the Romans could not treat so long as there was an enemy on Italian soil. He told Pyrrhus that the Senate seemed to him an assembly of kings. The firm mind of the Romans did not change when Pyrrhus marched north. Though he got within 40 miles of the city, there was no panic. Only a rush of men to join the army standing outside the walls to guard it. He had to retire south again, even after another victory in the next campaign. At Ascula, Rome was not shaken. The Italians stood firm. Pyrrhus knew that to win battles was not enough. He could not conquer Rome unless he could shake the solid resistance of a whole people. This he could not do, nor did he know how to appeal to the Italians and unite them against Rome. To the Italians, Pyrrhus was a foreigner, called in by the Tarentine Greeks, whom they rightly despised. Against him they rallied round Rome, and the Romans never wavered for an instant at the darkest hour. There had been no break in the will of the whole people. Pyrrhus saw this. He saw that the Romans would last him out. After Asculum, he crossed to Sicily and defeated the Carthaginians, the allies of Rome, who were gradually capturing the island from Agathocles the king. But though he soon overran a large part of this island, the Greeks in Sicily liked his iron rule no better than the Greeks of Tarentum had done. He returned to Italy, leaving the great fortress of Lilybaeum still in Carthaginian hands, crying as he sailed away, "What a battleground for Romans and Carthaginians I am leaving." In Italy, he fought one more big battle, at Beneventum. But it was a defeat. His hopes were ended. He had won glory for himself, but he had, and this he knew, helped to unite Italy under Rome. And as he saw, to prepare the way for a great struggle between Rome and Carthage, Pyrrhus saw, sooner than any Roman, a great struggle coming in which the fate of Rome was to be decided. He had shown the Romans the way, and made their strength visible to them, and turned their eyes beyond Italy, across the seas.
Carthage. The power of Carthage, to the men of the age of Pyrrhus, seemed infinitely greater than that of Rome. Rome at that time was but a single city whose rule did not extend even over the whole of Italy. Carthage was the head of an empire, built up on a trade which spread its name over the whole of the known world. The Punic or Phoenician people, as the ruling race in Carthage was called because of their dark skins, came from the east. Their earliest homes were in Arabia and Syria. It was from Tyre and Sidon, great and rich towns when Rome was hardly a village, that the traders came and settled in North Africa. Their ships, laden with woven stuffs and silk and cotton, dyed in rich colors, with perfumes and spices, ivory and gold, ornaments and implements and metal,
sailed all the navigable seas and brought home from distant places the goods and raw materials of different lands at a time when the Romans had hardly begun to sail the seas at all. Their vessels passed out of the Mediterranean through the straits and up to the little-known lands of the Atlantic. They brought home tin from distant Cornwall, silver from Spain, iron from Elba, copper from Cyprus. Carthage itself was a magnificent city and the richest in the world. Its citizens lived in wealth and idleness on the labor of others. Trade supplied them with riches. The hardy tribes of Africa, Numidians and Libyans, were their slaves, manned their fleets and armies. Their navy ruled the seas. They had settlements in Spain. Corsica and Sardinia were owned by Carthage. All the west of Sicily was in their hands. See caption. The desolation of Carthage today. In Sicily, the Carthaginians and the Romans first met. The eastern part of the island was ruled by King Hiero of Syracuse, but raids on it were constantly made by the people of Messina. After one of these, Hiero attacked Messina. His force was driven off by the Carthaginians, who then occupied the citadel. The people of the town looked around for assistance and finally appealed to Rome. Messina was not a Roman city, but the Romans saw that if the Carthaginians were left in position, they would hold a bridge from which they could easily cross into Italy. That was the question that had to be faced when the Senate met to consider whether they should help the people of Messina. To do so meant war with Carthage at once. Not to do so might mean war with Carthage. Later on, the Senate called upon the people to decide. The people voted for war now.